As the conflict in Ukraine continues to escalate, the spotlight has shifted to NATO's response and military spending commitments among its member states. During a recent meeting of defense ministers in Brussels, U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced that NATO allies are nearing a consensus on a significant increase in defense spending, with discussions focused on a commitment of 5% of GDP. This represents a considerable jump from current targets, a move that many European nations see as ambitious if not unrealistic. "We think very close, almost near consensus on a 5% commitment for NATO," Hegseth stated, emphasizing the need for all member countries to contribute adequately to collective security. He highlighted that several nations are already exceeding the existing 2% guideline, though he did not name those that remain hesitant to meet the proposed target. The push for increased spending comes amid heightened tensions resulting from Ukraine's ongoing defense against Russia, which has led to calls for greater military preparedness across Europe. The urgency of these discussions is underscored by Ukraine's dire circumstances, as the war with Russia has necessitated an almost staggering defense budget of approximately 26% of its GDP. Ukrainian officials are already eyeing revisions to their 2025 budget to bolster defense spending further, with Finance Minister Serhiy Marchenko indicating the need for increased resources to meet military demands. Ukraine's current defense allocation stands at 2.23 trillion hryvnias, £39.5 billion, with the country receiving around £98 billion in international financial support since the war began. While NATO's meeting in Brussels was taking place, the conflict on the ground remained intense. Ukrainian forces reported a successful strike against a Russian military base, claiming to have hit a unit of missile forces in Bryansk. This is indicative of Ukraine's ongoing efforts to disrupt Russian military operations, particularly following a daring drone raid that reportedly destroyed or damaged up to 40 Russian aircraft at airbases across the country. In a further escalation of rhetoric, Russian President Vladimir Putin, during a telephone conversation with former U.S. President Donald Trump, characterized Ukraine's government as a terrorist organization, complicating prospects for peace negotiations. This narrative serves to justify Russia's refusal to engage in meaningful ceasefire discussions, as Putin asserted that Ukraine does not genuinely seek peace. Such claims align with the Kremlin's long-standing strategy of undermining Ukraine's legitimacy on the international stage. The implications of these developments are profound. As NATO discussions center around defense spending, the alliance's cohesion becomes crucial in the face of Russian aggression. The U.S. has expressed a clear expectation that allies must step up, with Hegseth noting deterrence peace through strength, but it cannot just be reliance on U.S. capabilities. This sentiment echoes through NATO's corridors as member nations grapple with the balance between military funding and domestic priorities, including healthcare and education. Looking ahead, the dynamics within NATO and the ongoing war in Ukraine will likely continue to shape geopolitical landscapes. The alliance's willingness to adapt to the evolving security environment will be tested, particularly as calls for increased military investment collide with national budgetary constraints. As the conflict intensifies, the need for a unified, robust NATO response will be critical in deterring further Russian advances and ensuring the security of Europe. The coming months may prove pivotal in determining both military strategies and diplomatic avenues for peace. The ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia escalated dramatically today as Russian forces launched a series of glide bomb strikes on the southern city of Kherson, injuring 2 civilians and severely damaging the regional administration building. This attack, part of a broader wave of violence that has gripped the region, comes amidst heightened tensions following a recent phone conversation between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, where Trump warned of potential Russian retaliation for Ukraine's operations. Local authorities in Kherson reported that 4 glide bombs were used in the attack, which obliterated parts of the government building and caused extensive damage to several high-rise structures. Oleksandr Prokudin, the governor of the Kherson region, shared harrowing footage of the aftermath, illustrating the scale of destruction. "For KABs flew through this place," he remarked, referencing the modified Soviet-era munitions capable of delivering massive explosive payloads. President Trump indicated that Putin expressed a strong desire for Russia to respond to Ukraine's recent drone strikes, which reportedly destroyed a significant portion of Moscow's bomber fleet. Putin will have to respond, Trump stated, underscoring the grim outlook for peace negotiations. As the situation deteriorates, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for immediate and maximum sanctions against Russia, urging the international community to exert pressure in light of the recent attacks that have resulted in civilian casualties, including the death of a 1-year-old child in Pryluki. Zelensky condemned the Russian strikes as acts of terrorism, stating this was another massive strike by terrorists. Russian terrorists who kill our people every night. He emphasized the need for unified international action to curtail Russia's offensive capabilities and to prevent further loss of life. The conflict has also seen drone attacks from Ukraine targeting Russian military installations, including a recent operation dubbed Operation Spiderweb, which allegedly resulted in significant damage to Russian heavy bombers. This bold move has shifted the dynamics of the conflict, prompting a fiery response from the Kremlin. Dmitry Peskov, a spokesperson for Putin, confirmed that Russia would retaliate at a time of its choosing, framing Ukraine's drone operations as acts of state terrorism. In a separate yet related development, NATO defense ministers convened in Brussels to discuss defense spending amidst the ongoing conflict. U.S. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth announced that the alliance is nearing consensus on a commitment for NATO members to allocate 5% of their GDP to defense, a significant increase from the current 2% benchmark. Hegseth emphasized that the need for collective military readiness is paramount in light of the escalating threats from Russia. Meanwhile, as Ukraine grapples with the devastating impacts of the conflict on its civilian population, it is also ramping up its military capabilities. The Ukrainian government has announced plans to increase its defense budget significantly, reflecting the urgent need for additional resources to support its armed forces in the ongoing struggle against Russian aggression. As the situation continues to evolve, the humanitarian toll remains staggering, with millions displaced and tens of thousands killed since the onset of the conflict in February 2022. The international community watches closely, with calls for heightened sanctions against Russia growing louder. The repercussions of today's events are likely to reverberate far beyond the battlefield, influencing global geopolitical dynamics in the weeks and months to come. As both sides brace for further escalation, the prospect of peace remains elusive, casting a long shadow over the future of Ukraine and its people. In the ongoing geopolitical chess game between the United States and Russia, recent developments have sparked intense scrutiny and debate over the actions and words of key figures, particularly former President Donald Trump. A series of statements and interactions involving Russian President Vladimir Putin and even Pope Leo XIV have raised questions about the implications for international relations and the potential for conflict resolution, especially concerning the war in Ukraine. On June 5, 2025, Al Jazeera reported that Trump's recent social media comments, perceived as conciliatory towards Putin, have been met with a sharp rebuke from Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president. Medvedev's reaction underscores the delicate balance of power and rhetoric in the current geopolitical climate. Trump's statements allow Putin to further his agenda without consequence, Medvedev stated, emphasizing the need for a more robust U.S. stance against Russia's actions in Ukraine. Amid these tensions, Pope Leo XIV engaged in a significant dialogue with President Putin on June 4, where the humanitarian crisis in Ukraine took center stage. The Pope's call for peace and dialogue highlights the broader desire for resolution among global leaders. Matteo Bruni, director of the Holy See press office, conveyed the Pope's message, stating, "The Pope made an appeal for Russia to take a gesture that would favor peace, emphasizing the importance of establishing positive contacts between conflicting parties." The conversation also touched upon facilitating humanitarian aid and ongoing prisoner exchanges, further illustrating the multifaceted nature of the conflict. Adding to the complexity, Politico published an analysis questioning Trump's understanding of Putin's strategic maneuvers. The article argues that Trump's tendency to downplay Russia's aggressions could embolden Putin, allowing him to exploit weaknesses within U.S. foreign policy. This sentiment resonates with many political analysts who see a critical need for a unified and firm approach to counteract Russian expansionism. Conversely, as reported by Reuters, Putin has indicated that Russia must respond decisively to Ukrainian attacks, framing the conflict as a defensive strategy. This rhetoric illustrates the entrenched positions held by both sides, complicating any potential diplomatic progress. The cyclical nature of these statements reinforces the notion that dialogue may be insufficient to alter the trajectory of the conflict unless coupled with concrete actions. As these narratives unfold, the international community watches closely. The interplay of rhetoric and action from both Trump and Putin could set the stage for either escalated tensions or unexpected avenues for peace. The Pope's intervention, while well-intentioned, may serve as a reminder that spiritual and diplomatic efforts often require the backing of political will to effect real change. Looking ahead, the future of U.S.-Russia relations remains uncertain, with the specter of further conflict looming if diplomatic efforts falter. As leaders navigate this intricate landscape, the stakes are high, and the consequences of their decisions will reverberate across the globe. The world awaits to see if dialogue can triumph over discord in the ongoing struggle for peace in Ukraine. And the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, tensions have escalated sharply following a series of provocative drone strikes that have drawn international attention and concern. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is now calling for face-to-face talks with Russian President Vladimir Putin, despite the latter's insistence that there is nothing to talk about after Ukrainian attacks on Russian airfields. The situation is further complicated by fears that Putin may consider nuclear options in response to Ukraine's aggressive military strategies. On June 4, Zelensky addressed allies, urging them to maintain a firm stance against Putin's threats. If the world reacts weakly to Putin's threats, he warned, he sees that as a willingness to turn a blind eye to his actions. This statement underscores the precarious balance of power and the urgent need for a united front among Ukraine's supporters, particularly as Russia continues to respond with drone strikes that have resulted in civilian casualties in Ukraine, including the tragic death of a 1-year-old child in Pryluki. Recent Ukrainian operations have targeted Russian military assets with significant success. Reports indicate that Ukraine's Operation Spiderweb employed drone technology to strike multiple airbases across Russia, claiming the destruction of around 40 aircraft, including strategic bombers. U.S. officials have corroborated these claims, emphasizing the operation's significance in undermining Russia's aerial capabilities. This was a highly significant attack, noted unnamed U.S. officials, highlighting that approximately half of the targeted aircraft will likely be beyond repair. Despite these military advancements, the specter of further escalation looms large. Following the drone attacks, President Trump conveyed during a phone call with Putin that the Russian leader expressed a strong intention to retaliate. This exchange reflects the fraught diplomatic environment, as Zelensky, while advocating for continued military support from Western allies, also recognizes the necessity for dialogue. Many have spoken with Russia at various levels, but none of these talks have brought a reliable peace, Zelensky remarked, emphasizing that any diplomatic efforts must be backed by tangible pressure on Moscow. Putin, however, remains steadfast in his refusal to meet with Zelensky, viewing recent Ukrainian actions as terrorist acts. He has publicly questioned the viability of negotiations under such circumstances, suggesting that Ukraine's demands are simply a ruse to gain time and bolster its military position. How can any such meetings be conducted in such circumstances, he asked, reiterating his belief that Ukraine seeks to replenish its military capabilities rather than pursue genuine peace. The international community is closely monitoring these developments, particularly given the implications for nuclear stability. Putin has previously indicated that the use of nuclear weapons has not been deemed necessary, but his recent rhetoric and military doctrine revisions have raised alarms about potential future actions. Experts are concerned that continued escalation could lead to catastrophic consequences, especially if Putin perceives Ukraine's operations as existential threats. As military actions continue unabated, the prospect of meaningful negotiations appears dim. Both sides have established firm red lines, complicating the chances for a ceasefire. The Kremlin's demands are seen as non-starters for Ukraine and its allies, further entrenching the conflict. Analysts predict that without a shift in strategy or a breakthrough in talks, the war will continue to drag on, with increasing humanitarian costs. The situation remains fluid, and the international community's response will be crucial in shaping the next chapters of this conflict. As global leaders gather to discuss support for Ukraine, the question remains whether they can provide the necessary backing to deter further Russian aggression while simultaneously creating pathways for dialogue. The stakes are high, and the world watches closely as Ukraine and Russia navigate this perilous landscape.